Welcome to another segment of provocative conversations destined to provoke further thought and spark greater questions regarding God, church, and the religious establishments of both the past and the present. I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. Hello, I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself, ordained to do exactly what I do, provoke you to greater thought, into greater conceptual insight, conceptual understanding, conceptual appreciation, bringing you into greater precepts, into greater principles, ushering you into a realm of thought that will override and excel above all that you thought you knew, all that you desired to know but did not know, above all of the ignorance that was prevailing in your life. I believe that it is my divine purpose from God to teach in a way that any sound-minded individual would be able to understand. You would be amazed, but since I'm on the subject of the church and the prophetic utterances that God spoke to me regarding the church, you would be amazed at how unsound those within the church truly are. They think they're whole and that they are not in need of a physician. Yet they are the most unsound, most depraved-minded people of the smallest thought, independent of that which they are stuck in, the system of religion, the system of church. I know I just said a lot. It's like, man, did you use any type grammatical separations in any of that? And probably not, but I'll say it like this. Church folk messed up. Church folk got issues. Church folk ain't even sound no more. Church folk don't even sound right. Church folk, the sounds they make ain't even human. Church folk, the thoughts they have just don't make no sense. And it's not because it's so spiritually deep. That's deep, preacher. Preach, preacher. All that deep calling into deep. That ain't no deep. That's deep. Just deep doo-doo. It's deep doo-doo, but it ain't nothing deep spiritually. But see, if you're used to junk food, cow doo-doo tastes pretty good. Got a little milk in it. You know, it's a cow. Even though it ain't coming through where the milk comes from, it's still from the cow. You know, it's still part of the beef. You know, as you come to know God, as you come to experience God, as you move over into greater, you will come to understand that most of what you've been getting through the flow of the church has been nothing but junk. It is why the church is where it is today. Notice how the church was always supposed to be delivering you, but yet the church could not and cannot and has not been able to deliver itself. Not even from a virus? Ooh. Well, I thought it was supposed to be the devil, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and no weapon formed against me shall prosper, and every tongue that rises up against me, every virus that rises up against me, I shall condemn it, and I'll send it to the pits of hell when ain't got no scripture about it in hell. Yeah, the wages of sin is death, but church folk dying, and they claim they ain't got no more sin, but they dying. The wages of sin is death, and the virus is killing them. The wages of disobeying this virus is death too, church. I'm sure you've understood that now, right? You're going to be surprised at what God told me. Some of you aren't going to be surprised. Some of you are. Some of you, you're so prideful, you're going to act like you already knew this here and you were thinking this before I ever even said it or whatever else. I've lived with that for years and years with people. It amazes me how people know they hadn't done no research, no study, no nothing, but yet they've come up, with whatever and whatever and whatever and whatever and whatever. That ain't how that works. It's almost like the boy Zuckerberg who owns Facebook, and he's a multi-billionaire. Yet it was not even his initial thoughts. He stole this from his buddies. They called him into the square just to help them put this thing together in some logical form, or not a logical form, in some, I don't know, he was called in to be their typist. I'll just say it like that. He ended up taking their thoughts. I think it was 4 other men, took their thoughts, took what they gave birth to intellectually. He took that and ran with it. Now, he had to pay them multi-million-dollars, but look at what he has for the rest of his life as a result of what he took from them. This is what people do to you. They'll pick you, they'll pick your mind in order that they might take from you and brand it as their own. Now, some of them don't even know that they're doing this here, but that's what they do. If you hear my AC cut on, well, we're in between seasons in this October season in the South, and it still gets a little heated here and there. The weather doesn't know what it really wants to do right now. It's just right in between that fall and summer deal. Even though it is fall, it's still, the weather doesn't know what it wants to do, especially with all of this climate change and all of these hurricanes coming through the Gulf Coast and then cutting back out to the East Coast. And it's creating issues in the air, issues with bugs and mosquitoes at this time of the year. Just messy. So don't allow that noise to distract you. And I'll try not to do the same. Well, let's go back to what we were saying. Talking about the church. God's messages to me regarding the church. Let's jump right into it, head first. We're going to jump right into it. Now, when I was growing up in South Florida, if you grew up in South Florida, you know that South Florida is known for its beaches. Thank God for the beaches. South Florida is known for its beaches. South Florida is known for its pools. During the summertime, me and my cousins, I have so many family members in South Florida. So many hundreds and hundreds of family members on both my mother's and my father's sides. I did not know until I was an adult, until I was in my mid-20s or early 30s, how big my family was and how connected I was to so many people. I did not know it. I honestly did not know it. It didn't matter to me. It didn't register to me. But anyway, we would all go around and we didn't have swimming pools. My family didn't grow up poor. My mother and father, I lived a good life. My siblings and I lived a good life as far as I can recall. We never really struggled, or we did not know their struggle as kids, as teenagers. At least I didn't. Well, we didn't have a swimming pool, and none of my cousins had swimming pools or whatever. However, now my father would bring us to swimming pools that white people owned in Boca Raton, Florida. Boca Raton is where Rush Limbaugh lives, outside of where Donald Trump has Mar-a-Lago and all of that. I think Donald Trump's wife lives in Boca Raton. Boca Raton is a wealthy, wealthy place. Well, we only lived about 3 minutes away from Boca Raton, something like that, where the border of Boca Raton is. We would go to other people's houses to swim. And my father would bring us, and we would go to those swimming pools, and we would swim in the white people that my father knew, who he either worked with or was doing work for or knew, on the police force or whatever. But my cousins and I, on the black side of town, and many of them weren't living as good as we were, we didn't have swimming pools. So when we didn't want to go to the beach, we would just go to the different apartment complexes and the different hotels along the beach, and we would just jump in their pools. Now that I think about it, we must have been hell for those white folks. Here you are in my swimming pool with your dirty, black, ashy skin. Because if you black and you in South Florida and you get in that water and you come out that water and that water dries up, boy, you look like you turning. You look like an albino almost. You go into some other color. That's just what it is. Especially if you get that salt water on you. Boy, you be dry for days. Everything cracking up. Everything. You look like a crackhead. You all cracked up, white everywhere. Oh, crackhead, that boy on some show, not crack. And crack wasn't there back then. Crack didn't come to around the mid-'80s in South Florida or the early '80s in South Florida. We would go and jump in all of their pools. And anytime you jump in a pool, you better make sure you look at how deep that pool is. Because you jump in that pool and not knowing how deep it is, you might split your head open. You might hit your teeth on the ground, on the floor of that pool. You may scrape your lip. You may scrape your chin. You may scrape your chest. There's so many things that could happen to you jumping into a pool without preparing yourself or without putting your hands first. I've learned to put my hands first when I dive. So if the pool is more shallow than I think, or if my weight puts me to the bottom quicker than I anticipated, my hands would take the scratch. My palms would hit that, and I'll just like push off and push myself up high enough where it doesn't hit my face or I don't hit my head first. But right now, we're going to throw all precaution aside and we're just going to jump head first into this here. I think I've been bringing you into the deep long enough now where you can gauge where the bottom is and how deep we're going to go. And I'm sure you can be assured that you're not going to scrape your face. You're not going to break your front teeth out. You're not going to bust your lip. You're not going to bust your head open. So in this one, we're just going to go head first into this here. We're going to throw all caution to the wind. And we're just going to go head first into this pool. We're just going to dive into the deep as though it's the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to do this. Let's do this. On March the 22nd, 2020, God began to speak to me. On March the 18th, 2020, 4 days prior or 5 days prior to this, God began to tell me, you were in a shift and you were this, and this is what it is. And now you see what this season is. Okay. So this is where we are on the 22nd. So now I'm just coming to realize God is talking about now, but I still don't understand the pandemic and what it curtails. And I didn't know all that it would include and how it would go about. I didn't know this. I began to come to know it as time went on, and God spoke to me on 22 elongated periods within this 200 days, but within the first 100 days, for the most part, God gave me these things. But let's go ahead on and do this here. On the 22nd of March, that morning, God said to me, people will begin to lose their ministries. God knows I didn't know what I was talking about, but I was just writing it. People will begin to lose their ministries. People will begin to lose their members. I didn't know what God was talking about, even though I now knew that he was talking about now. But how is this going to come about where people are going to lose their ministries and people are going to lose their members? He said people will lose their members. They'll lose their employees. They'll lose their friendships. They'll lose their acquaintances. Did not know. He said people's lives will begin to unravel. He said their lives will begin to fall apart. God says, I am exposing the church as well. Exposing the church. God says the church is to be exposed as well. God says the church is not to be spared. Well, God always spare us. God's hand is upon the church. We are the apple of his eye. We are his chosen ones. We are his, and everybody else are his cursed ones, huh? Everyone else is his rejected ones, huh? His wretched ones. Okay. God says the church is not to be spared. God was basically saying to me several things there, I believe. I believe, one, hey, I want you to know that I'm not sparing the church. The church is not going to be outside of what's getting ready to happen or what is occurring. The church is in the middle of this. The church does not get a get out of jail free card in this. And he was also saying to me, and I don't want you to spare the church when I have you to teach this and talk about this the way that I'm doing right now. He was saying to me, the church is not to be spared. You make sure you have a segment, you have a subtopic for the church. Lord have mercy. Anyway, and I don't know why he gonna have mercy, but because he gonna do what he gonna do anyway. But I just one of them cliches. Lord have mercy. When it's all messed up and deep, you just say, Lord, have mercy. Have mercy. Ham mercy. Ham and mercy. All right. Well, the church is not to be spared. The church will not be spared. Nothing will be spared in the church. Oh, my goodness. The church is not to be spared. The church will not be spared. And nothing will be spared in the church. Wow. God says nothing will be stable in the church. God says the basic foundation of the church will shake. The basic foundation of the church will shake. Wow. The basic foundation of the church will shake. God says everything that is built upon the basic foundation of the church will crumble in the shake. Wow. God was basically saying to me, there is a spiritual earthquake that is coming to the foundation of the church. And in that spiritual earthquake, just like a physical earthquake, as that bottom surface or the contents beneath the surface of that upper foundation, as it begins to shift and shake, everything that is built upon that foundation that is now shaken because of the disturbance that is underneath the surface will begin to crumble and fall apart, just like buildings do when an earth quakes. God says everything that is built upon the foundation of the church, everything that is built upon the foundation of the church will crumble in the shake. Let me say that again. God says everything excludes nothing. Everything doesn't leave anything out. Everything means everything. And anything will never mean everything. Everything means all things. Anything does mean everything in relation to anything that is built upon this foundation, the church. It is part of the everything. It's getting ready to crumble in the shake. There is a shaking, a divine shaking that is going forth, God stated to me on March 22nd. And in that shaking, the church, everything that is founded upon the foundation of the church will crumble. If we can just get back to the church house, if we could just get back to the saints, if we could just back to our communion, if we could just get back to our Boy Scouts and our Girl Scouts club, if we could just get back to the 5th Sunday of the month, if we could just get back to the 1st Sunday of the month, if we could, we'll crumble. There's nothing to go back to. God says everything that is founded upon the basic foundation of the church will cease to exist. If your religion is built upon the foundation of the church, it's getting ready to cease to exist. If your relationship with God is built upon the foundation of the church, your relationship with God is getting ready to cease. At least the relationship that you have conjured, that man has conjured for you to follow, will cease to exist. If your economic status, your class status in society is founded upon the foundation of the church, is getting ready to cease to exist. God says the church that you know will cease in its existence. God, now wait a minute, hold up now, hold it now. There used to be a song. There used to be a song, a rap song. They say, hold up, wait a minute. That's what I'm saying to God. Hold up, wait a minute. Come on now, God. You gotta put some substance in this. You got to tell me something. God says the church that you know will cease in its existence. Preacher, what are you talking about? The church has always been here. The church has always been the church. Without the church, the world wouldn't be nothing. Without the church, God wouldn't even be on earth if it wasn't for the church. The church is the hands of God on the earth. God needs the church. The church is important to God. God, everything is structured around the church. Everything is why is you arguing with me? Look, man, I got more mail to deliver. I'm just stopping by your raggedy house just to tell you about your raggedy self and your raggedy church. The church, as you know, will cease in its existence. How do you know the church? Then that's how it's going to cease. That's what's going to cease. How do you see the church? Okay, well, that you see is what's getting ready to cease in its existence. Well, preacher, you fix that up, preacher. I ain't fixing nothing up. I'm telling you how God told me. He didn't fix it up. Fix it up, preacher. That's your job. Bring it on home. Nah. All that I got to bring to the graveyard, because God says that's ceasing to exist. Anything that ceases to exist needs to be buried. Isn't the graveyard the appropriate place to bury dead things? All right. Play the music. Louisiana. You know how those funeral people come, walk through the streets of Louisiana and celebrate death. And they do their little Louisiana hula hoop dance with their umbrellas and doing their shake. You know, I like that. I like to see that. They got the horns and the trumpets and everything doing their thing. Well, that's what's going on, church. You need to do your funeral procession, because that's where it's at. Let's keep moving, because I got so much to tell you all about. We got several more recordings to do with this here. God told me to take your time with this too. Take your time with this one. God says to me, again, preachers will lose their positions. Preachers will lose their pay. Preachers will lose their financial stability. Preachers will lose their possessions. Preachers will lose their members. Preachers will lose their ministries. Preachers will lose their buildings. God says preachers will lose their influence. Their influence, God? He says the influence of the preachers will dwindle. Their influence will dwindle away. God says there will no longer be a need for the influence of the preachers as there has been. He said their influence will no longer be necessary for where God is taking us. Preacher, as long as the earth is living, we supposed to have preacher. What you talking about, preacher? We going in. How that going to happen? Well, I'm sure the Pharisees and the Sadducees, at least the Pharisees, they surely thought that no way the law could be ended. The law is everything. The law is scripted by God. No way, Jesus, you're coming here and telling me that the dispensation of the law is ended. We will not have it as such. Jesus said, well, you can go ahead on and kill me, but all you're going to do is seal the fact that the law is ceasing when I cease or as I cease. You can kill me, maybe. You might get some stronger, holes in you than you might put in me, though. But reading that how you want. Don't you come weak. God says their influence will dwindle away. There will no longer be a need for the influence of the preachers as there has been. Their influence will no longer be necessary. God says to me, there will no longer be a need for missionaries. Lord have mercy. What is you telling me about missionaries for? I remember one time in Germany in 1994, I was preaching or teaching at a Church of God in Christ. And in my young zeal, my young zealotness, I got up there with fire and brimstone, but not about hell, not about demonic spirits or the devil, but just about the traditions of men. And the name of the message was, stop nullifying the power of God through your traditions. And I went on a roll. And I began to tell the people what God was saying and what Scripture was saying and just laying down some fire. And then I said, so many of you, because of the Church of God in Christ, they have missionaries. Women are missionaries. And I said, we have so many missionaries in the church, but my question is, where is your mission, missionaries? Because I don't ever see you go nowhere. I don't ever see you doing anything. You're just always right here at the church house every time it swings open, and you ain't never on no mission in the church other than the mission to see what the latest gossip is. That just messed me up. Or when you on a mission to sleep with the pastor, when you on your mission to get to that hotel where pastor gonna meet you on the road. Ooh, don't you say that. And it ain't just the women, it's the men with the men. It ain't just the women with the men, it's the women with the women. Oh, you say, well, I didn't know that went on. You didn't know. Well, actually, it's good that you didn't know. Because me, myself, personally, when I began to understand how much was going on, it really messed me up. So you don't need to know all of it. Okay. Well, let me say this here. You did not need to know all of it. Now, many of you do need to know it, because now there's a time to speak, and there's a time to be quiet. There's a time to know when to speak and a time to know when to shut up. This is not a time to shut up and dribble. This is a time to stand up and speak out. Speak loud, spare not. God says there will no longer be a need for missionaries. Now, I didn't know that the pandemic was going to do what it did, and it was going to shut down the airlines, and it was going to shut down nations, and I still didn't understand the pandemic. I understood, okay, a virus out here, okay, but how does all this fit into what God help me? Now we see that you can't fly. Some countries don't even want us there. Other countries, you better not go over there. Everything is in an uproar, both over here and over in those different nations. God says there will no longer be a need for missionaries. Missionaries will not be necessary. He said the funding will no longer sustain the missionaries. The funding will no longer be available. God says there will no longer be a need for people to travel outside of their own country to help those in need in other countries. He's saying the need will be so great in the countries that you're in. Well, let me just say what God said right here. He says, for the need will be so great amongst the country that you come from in your own country that there will not be enough funding to even get you to other countries to so-called help them with their needs. We've always walked over the local man in the ditch to go to the far countries of this world for some brownie points, calling ourselves, we're going over there to feed the people. And you go over there and feed them rice and water. But you take millions upon billions of dollars from us to do it. And then 78% or higher doesn't even go to the people. It goes to you, your ministry, and Jimmy and Tommy and all of them. Lord have mercy. God says traveling preachers will begin to cease. Traveling preachers will begin to cease. He said no longer will preachers travel throughout different regions. Oh boy, no longer will there be a need for them to do so. God says the demand will be so great in their own cities and residences that they will not be able to travel. He said the funding will no longer be available to do so as well. God says people will no longer feed the greed of the preacher. Oh my goodness. Say that again, God. Oh, say that again, preacher. God says people will no longer feed the greed of the preacher. God says the greed of the preacher will be exposed. He says the greed of the preacher will be showcased. God says, I will bring an end to the greed of the preacher. God says the exposure of the preacher will bring an end to the mass greed of preachers. An exposure of the preacher is coming forth. Wow. God says their schemes will be exposed. Their tricks will cease to work. Their income will cease to flow. God says, I am bringing a halt, H-A-L-T, to the mass greed of the church. God says no longer will preachers be able to starve the people while they themselves feed themselves greedily. No longer will the preacher be able to starve the people and take from their household in order to have plenty in their own households. Ooh, God says the greed of the preacher will cease. The greed of the preacher will create a starvation amongst the preachers. Oh, because your appetite is so bougie, because you are so used to buying $400 shirts, $2,000 robes, $1,000 pair of shoes, pairs of shoes, the gold, the diamond, the Bentleys, the Mercedes, the BMWs, the top of the line. God says, because of your greed, that greed in this season and beyond this season is going to create a starvation amongst preachers. God says their greed will bring them into a period of starvation. The preachers will starve themselves to death and will have to make ends meet. You're going to have to make short ends meet together, and you're going to have to make ends meet. You're going to have to figure out how you going to do this here and keep all of this stuff that you've amassed, and now you don't have the income to keep it up. He says, and even in them trying to make their ends meet, they will fail. They will fail to do so because of their greed. God says churches will begin to dwindle. God says churches will begin to close. God, how churches going to close? What, people going to go home? And what are you talking about? It's going to close. Churches will begin to dwindle. Churches will begin to close. God says preachers will begin to die. Wait a minute. God, preachers will begin to die. Now understand this, people. When God told me this, there was no preacher that died. There were no church folks that died that I knew of, and the church was still open. God says churches will begin to close. Preachers will begin to die. Preachers will begin to die. He says some will die from their own starvation of greed. Some will die from the virus. Well, he said some will die from their own starvation of greed, period. And then he says some will die from the virus, period. And then God says the virus will take a lot of them out. Lord have mercy, God. You said the virus is going to take a lot of the leaders out of the church. But God said, upon this rock I'll build my church. You built the church. The virus will take a lot of them out. I'm staying right here because a lot of you know that your pastor has died, even the first lady. A lot of you know that your pastor has contracted. A lot of you know that your bishop has died. I'll get to him in a second too. A lot of you know that your leaders have been taken out of here through this virus. Now, if it was the devil, you could have rebuked him. In fact, you did rebuke him and he still died. Why? Because the church is not spared. But before they died, I began to tell people what God said. And as it began to happen, people started texting me and stuff and sending me articles. God says preachers will begin to die. God says some will die from their own starvation of greed. Some will die from the virus. He said the virus will take a lot of them. He said the virus will shake the church. How did I know that he meant to this degree? The virus will be used to shake the core of the church. He said many within the church will become sick from the virus. We're in October. Back in March, you didn't see this here. Those who God spoke to did, or at least heard it. Maybe they couldn't see it, but they heard it. He said many within the church will become sick from the virus. And we know this has happened. The church has become the super spreader location of the virus throughout the world. Hundreds and hundreds of people, whether we're talking in Korea, whether we're talking in perhaps Africa, whether we're talking throughout the United States, God says many within the church will be taken by the virus. I don't need to beat that too bad. You all see that has occurred now. Many will not recover from the virus. We've seen that too. If it is true, it is alleged that even the bishop who just died just weeks ago, or maybe a week and a half ago, Bishop Ellis, don't want to call too many names, but I did read an article that it was alleged that not only did he die, but he also contracted the virus. And then it seems as though they insinuated that, if I recall it correct, that he recovered from the virus, or so they say he recovered from the virus. But it's strange that what God says, many will not recover from the virus. It could have been other issues for why he died. I don't know. I know I can't believe everything that I read, but here and there I'll look at the news clippings late at night and see what has happened in the course of the day and see if the things that God has said to me are manifested themselves. I'm testing the temperature. I don't get my information from the news, but I get my temperature of what God has already informed me about to see, okay, God says it's going to be hot this week. Okay, so I go and check the news and see, okay, is the day going to be the hot day? Or is tomorrow going to be the hot day? I'm not looking necessarily for information. I'm looking for what the temperature is and where things are. Anyhow, the church, God says, is not exempt. The church will not be exempt from what is occurring. God says no longer will the church be exempt. No longer will the church be able to exempt itself. God said the church is not above the people. God says the church is no more special than the people. For it is the people who both make up and establish the church for what it is. And I think those within the leadership of the church, they think they're more special than the people. But God said it's not so. He said it is the people who make up and establish the church for what it is. He said, but the church has begun to make and establish the people. God says, I bring people into the church house to help establish the church, to help establish the movement, or to help establish the hearts and minds of people. But when people go into the church with their gifts and calls, what happens is they begin to be hushed by those in ministry. And then those in ministry begin to make and establish the people, when in actuality, the people are coming with their gifts and offerings to make and establish the church. But the opposite has happened. The church has begun to crank out its own kind. In doing so, the church has suppressed the kind that these people have come to administer or come to nurture. We were supposed to be going into these gatherings to have that which God has given us to be nurtured. But in actuality, instead of it becoming a place of nurturing, the church has become a place of neutering. You neuter a dog that you don't want to reproduce of his kind. The church has become the shop for neutering the people. You neuter the people, you spade the people so that they won't reproduce. You want them to be who you are, and then they only become a production of who you are and who you are not, though you should be. The powers that be within the church have begun to make the people, instead of the people making the church what the church is to be. God says the church has become more of an influence over the people than the people are upon the church. He said instead of the people coming into the church and influencing the people and doing the influence, instead of the people bringing their influence, bringing their gifts and bringing their gifts to express itself throughout, what has happened is the church itself has begun to influence the people. He says the church's influence is greater than the people's influence. The system of the church. He says the church is now influencing the people in a greater manner than the people are influencing the church. He said instead of the church becoming the people have become the church. The people have become the church. Now we have nothing but 1 billion walking churches. Toe up. From the inside up, from the floor up, all the way to the outside. Just toe up from the core. God says instead of the church structure becoming the heart of the people have become the heart and structure of the church. God is saying instead of the people becoming the heart of the church has become the people. Let me say that again. Instead of the people coming there and becoming the heart of the church, because the heart of the church should be the people. Instead of that occurring, the heart of the church has become the heart of the people. The systems of the church, the systemic issues of the church has become the systemic issues of the people. The systematic teachings of the church have become the systematicness of the hearts of the people. In Matthew 23:15, it speaks to that. However, I won't give you that. I won't give you Matthew 23:15. God says the church's influence has become a greater influence than the people's influence. He said the church's influence is causing the people to lose their influence. You go into the church house with all that God is giving you, and the longer you stay in there, the more dull your ministry becomes, the more dull your light becomes, because the church first deprograms you and then reprograms you into who they are, who the church is, how the church believes and thinks. And if you don't think that way, they'll label you as a heretic, such as myself, and then they'll kick you out. Instead of the people becoming the heart of the church structure, The people's heart becoming the structure of the church. The church structure in the heart of the people who instituted the church and all, their heart has become the people's heart. Now people are walking around with tore up hearts, and these are those people who will kill you over the church, who would want to assassinate someone for talking against their pastor or talking against their crooked, tricking pastor. You don't talk about my pastor. If he raped me, this is my stuff anyway. He can do what he want. I give it to him. He ain't taking it. He ain't raping me. You just as ignorant as you want to be, and you don't even realize that's what it is. Anyway, you don't talk about my pastor, and I give him all money. It's my money. I give who I want to give it to. You don't talk about my pastor. My pastor did good. My pastor look good. My pastor is why they good for you. My pastor and his wife, she first lady. That's the best first lady in the world. The best pastor in the world. Man, be quiet. God says the church's influence is causing the people to lose their influence. God says the church has stifled the influence of the people. He said the people no longer have an influence. He said the people no longer have permission to influence. The people have lost their influence. The people have lost their vision. The people have lost their voice. God says the influence of the people has been stifled. He says the positions of the people within the church have been stifled. I know you say, well, what is stifle? What does stifle mean? Again, even though I look up many words, I don't always give you the definitions of the many words that I've used in any set of teaching or speaking that I hear God speak to me. However, because I did look up this particular word, I'll give you the definition of stifle. To stifle means to interrupt or cut off the voice. It means to keep in or hold back. It means to repress. To stifle means to kill by preventing respiration, not allowing you to breathe. To stifle means to smother or suffocate. To stifle means to smother or suppress. It means to feel or cause to feel discomfort and difficulty in breathing. It means to crush or stamp out. It means to conceal or hide. It means to suppress the development, the creativity, or the imagination of. It means to muffle, to obstruct, to block passage through, to asphyxiate, to die from the lack of oxygen. To stifle means to deprive of oxygen and prevent from breathing. It means to hold in check. The church is holding the people in check. It means to decrease or dull the sound of. You go into the church house with fire. You go in there knowing your ministry and knowing what God has called you to do. But give it a little time. You've decreased in your fire. Your message has been dulled out now. Why? Because the church dummies you down and then they build you back up to look like them. To keep from being published or transmitted, to extinguish or put out. To stifle means to inhibit, to oppress, to forcefully prevent, to put down, sit down by power or authority. It's the act of preventing severely repressive actions, oppressive due to a lack of fresh air. God says this is what the church is doing and has done to my people. The church has stifled the influence of the people. The people no longer have an influence. The people no longer have permission to influence. The people have lost their influence. The people have lost their vision. They've lost their voice. The people's influence has been stifled. The positions of the people within the church have been stifled. Those in position have stifled the people of their influence. They've stripped the people of their positions of influence. God says the people are no longer positioned to have an influence. The people are no longer able to be in their positions of influence because of the church. The people have lost their positions of influence because of how the church stifles us and strips us and rapes us of the gifts of the call to flow in within that institution or those individual institutions of the system of the church. God says the leaders of the church have stifled the people from having an influence. He says people are viewed as a threat whenever they come against the establishments of the church. The people who were once in position were viewed as a threat to the systems of the church. Anyone who has been a threat to the systems of the church's structure has been stripped. People have been stripped of their standing simply because of their potential threat to the church's systems. That would be me. People have been authorized, God said, to be a threat to the systems of the church. God says, I have given people, I have authorized people to go into the systems of the church and interrupt and disrupt the church. He says, people have been authorized by me to be a threat to the systems of the church. God says people have been ordained to their positions of threat. Moses was a threat to the Egyptian leadership. David was a threat to Saul's kingship. Jesus was a threat to the establishments of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Paul was a threat to the church structure. Joseph was a threat to his brothers. He was initially seen as a potential threat to Potiphar or the Pharaoh and those at that time. Oh, isn't that something? The children of Israel, as they began to grow and multiply in number in the book of Exodus chapter 1, they were seen as a potential threat. If we keep letting them grow and mature as they're doing, they're going to outnumber us and then they're going to overtake us. A threat. Wow. Isn't that something? A threat. I'm not even coming here to bother you, but you see me as a threat. Wow. Listen to what God says. People have been authorized to be a threat to the systems of the church. People have been ordained to the positions of their threat. People's threat upon the systems of the church is authorized by me. God says, I authorized them. I authorized the people to be a threat to the systems of the church. God says, but the preachers and the powers that be have chosen to do otherwise. Wow, you're going to undo what God is. Oh, preacher. Those in position, God says, have been chosen to silence the people who are a threat. Those in position have chosen, not have been chosen, but in that too, there's some divinity there to say it that way as well. But those in position have chosen to silence the people who are a threat. The people's voices have been placed on silent. You know, you put your phone on silent. Every now and then, even on silent, even, at least with my Apple phone, some calls will still break through. That's just how it is in the church. Some of us still break through. The people's voices have been snuffed out by those in authority simply because of their threat upon the authoritative systems. God says, but no longer will the people's voices be silenced. No longer will their voices be placed on silent. God says the people's voices will be heard amongst the people, and their voices will be received amongst the people. God says this is a season of hearing. This is a season to hear. This is a season where people will be heard. God says the voices of the silenced will be heard in this season. God says people who have not been heard will be heard. People who have not been called upon will be called upon. God says the people will begin to listen to the voices of those that I have placed in the universe. Notice he didn't say people will begin to listen to the voices of the preachers in the church house or from the church house who represent the church. No, he said the people will begin to listen to the voices that I have placed in the universe. Those very voices that preachers have had tried to shut out, have tried to stifle, have tried to get a gag order issue, whether by legal courts or by the church system or the bishopric and whatever, however. Well, it says the people will begin to hear the voices of those that I have ordained in this universe. God says the people will begin to believe the voices of those that I have placed in the universe to be heard. He says people who have not been silenced will become silent. Those who was doing all that talking, those who were in all of those positions, and you were calling the shots, and you were saying who would and who couldn't. You were saying who would sit down and sit in that pew until I tell you to get up. You will now be sat down in that pew, and you won't get up, some of you. People who have not been silenced will now become silent. Listen, church, this is to you. People who have been heard will not be heard. People who have been heard will not be heard. People who were once heard will no longer be heard. Those who have been making much noise will now make no noise. He said the noise of the noisy will be silenced. He says, I am silencing the voices of those who have been noisy and disruptive. He said the noise and the disruption will cease from those individuals who have been noisy and disruptive, disrupting God's order where God is taking us in this season. The noise and disruption from those people will cease during this season. Doesn't mean that it's going to start up in the next season. He's saying in this season, that stuff will cease. It will cease to be. Don't mean that you're coming back, because God said, I'll shut a door that no man can open. Their noise and disruption will cease to exist. He says substance will be of utter importance during this season. Whatever you bringing forth, whatever you are speaking forth in the name of God, there has to be substance there, and the substance has to be relevant. Let's keep going. This season will require those who speak to have substance. The voices of those who have been noisy and disruptive but void of any substance will now lose their influence amongst the people. You just running your mouth and saying a lot of nothing. God says during this season, people will cease from listening to the voices of those who are void of substance. He says people will no longer listen to those who are in authority within the church who are void of substance. God, you're going to be surprised, apparently, of how many folk you've been listening to that really didn't have any true lasting substance. In fact, their substance was so weak it couldn't get you through the first phase of this pandemic period. Watch what I say. There will be a great need within people. He said the needs of the people will be great. He said the needs of the people will be greater than any other period in the history of this nation. He says the world will feel their need. God says the world itself will feel its inner hunger. This is not just a local thing or a national or just a nationwide thing. It's a worldwide thing. It's a pandemic. The world will feel, F-E-E-L, its inner thirst. God says people will no longer support ministries of those who are void of life-changing substance. He said the ministries of those who are void of life-changing substances will begin to implode. When something implodes, it closes in on itself and it is destroyed, or it destroys itself from within. He said their ministries will begin to crumble. Their ministries will begin to close its doors. Their ministries will cease in their existence. Their season has ended. God says this season will demand substance. This season will place a demand upon those who possess substance. If you possess substance, you're in a good hour. Substance will become very important throughout this season. This season will put a load upon those with substance. Those with substance will see a great demand placed upon them, as people will demand greater substance. During this season, God says, whoever is void of substance, whoever is void of life-changing substance will cease to be heard. He said the voices of those with no substance will cease to be heard. He says no longer will their voices be heard. No longer will people attempt to feed or to be fed through the voices of those who are void of necessary substance. He says no longer will people feed into the voices of those who are void of substance. He says people will begin to turn themselves inward. People will begin to turn inward for what they need. They will begin to search inwardly. They will begin to hear inwardly. They will not seek to be heard outwardly. Their seeking will be inward. God says no longer will people run to and fro to hear from me. He says no longer will people need to travel to hear. He says the hearing will be within them. He says the voice within the people will speak. The people will begin to hear the speaking from within. This is a quiet season, God says. Yet this is a speaking season. This is a quiet season. And some of you know, especially my household and those in my community, this has been a very quiet season. We went through the summer without hardly any noise outside or whatever. This is a quiet season. But God says this is a speaking season. It's quiet, but it's only quiet so that I can speak where you can hear me. He says this is a speaking and a seeking season. He said this is a season where people will seek me. He said people will seek words from me during this season. They will seek words that are relevant to this season. God says only words that are relevant to this season will be effective. So you can come up with all your 10 steps to this and 10 steps out of that and whatever else. Only words that are relevant to this season will be effective. Words that are not in this season will not be effective. Words that are not relevant to the present will have no effect upon or within the present. Let me say that one again. Words that have no relevance to the present state of your living. Words that are not relevant to that of this season, God says will have no effect upon or within the present, because these are not words regarding the present. So they do not address or change anything in the present. God says only present words will have an impact during this season. Only present words will have an impact upon the people of this period. People will only seek words that will impact the season they are in. They will not stomach words that are not spoken for this season. Man, if you don't get your religious stuff out of here, I don't want to hear nothing you got to say. Get out of here, man, before I hit you or call the police on you. I ain't trying to hear that. Get that noise away from me. Preacher, y'all couldn't even tell me this thing was coming. Y'all didn't even let me prepare. Give me a chance. Doggone, preacher, I came on Easter. Hell, that's still one day out the year, dog. You couldn't tell me nothing. Preacher, I even came on Christmas. I did. My whole family. And still had on my, preacher, I ain't never had no suit kicking like that. And I showed up and you still didn't tell me what's going to happen in January, February, and March. Preacher, I didn't go to the club at midnight on the first of the year. I didn't go to the club. And stuff was happening that night. I went to the church house to bring the church in right, to bring the new year in right. Preacher, you had a chance right then to tell me what type season it is, but you tell me this is a season of prosperity. This is a season where everybody in this church house, what you give tonight is going to assure you for the next 10 years, you will have no lack. You will have no sickness. You will have no disease. You will have no issues. Your family is going to thrive. Your children are going to thrive. Your children are going to receive money this year to go to college. This year, this semester, coming up in the next week or two. In the January 2020, your kids will go off to a major university, an Ivy League university. Your children will do well. Your children will this. Your children will that. Go out there and get that house. Get that big house. Get one you can't afford. Let it be so big it's beyond your faith belief. Do it. Yin Yang Twins had a song saying, do it. Go look it up. Now, the preacher wasn't even telling you what was getting ready to come in the pandemic because his blind butt couldn't see. Stevie Wonder was sitting there saying, look, do you see what I see? And here's Ray Charles sitting over there saying thing. Hey, look over there. Don't you see that, damn it? Look at it over there, damn it. And you couldn't see nothing. Preacher couldn't see nothing. Now you went and bought that house. Now you in the hole. You went and bought that house and lost that job. Oh, you went and bought that car. That's a 2020 there. The Lord said, whatever I can put my faith upon, whatever I can pray, he'll give it to me. I named it and I claimed it and I went there and put anointing oil on that car. Just put it on that car. I claimed that car and I got it. Yep. And you got that slip telling you no longer have a job now. And you on unemployment, and unemployment is drying up. And, the stimulus packet, that's not going to be enough. And you're not even going to have food. And why the preacher didn't tell me that? Because he didn't know himself. He was too stuck into his own greed, his own suits, his own vehicles, his own houses, his own hoes, his own side chicks, his side male chicks, her side male chicks, her side female chicks. Tricky chicks. That's what they all into. Listen, preachers, you know it. That's why you don't want to hear it. And there's more to it than this. Stay tuned, people, because if this is truly a season of great exposure where the church itself is part of the exposure, stay tuned, people. You will see it for yourself. And look, I'm looking out one eye trying to see what I see too with it all. Why? Because I want to know, what was I missing? What was I missing? Not to be nosy, but what was I missing? Because I want to see, God, where was I? How much was I seeing that was there to be seen? I want to know. So anyway, I'm telling you. Well, let me just say this and then I'll wrap it up. Well, I tell you what, I won't even go any further. We'll pull it at this here. We'll stop it at this. And we'll pick up in the next one. I hope that you're growing with this. I hope that this is taking you somewhere. There's so much more to come just in this topic alone. You want to stay tuned to this. I promise you. I'm not like them preachers telling you, boy, come out tonight, boy. Something big gonna come out tonight. Nah, I'm not telling you that just to blow you up and to deliver you nothing. I'm telling you because I know what God told me. And when you hear what God told me, which I have not told you a third of it yet, or even a fourth of it yet, maybe an eighth of it, maybe an eighth. When you hear it, you will realize I wasn't bringing you along just for the ride alone. Until the next one.